A man who sculpts a companion from his own loneliness should not be surprised when it is carved with teeth. The winter the Blackwood Pines lumber mill shut down, my husband Arthur stopped speaking to me. We lived in a drafty, A-frame cabin an hour outside of Portland, Oregon, surrounded by acres of suffocating, towering Douglas firs that blocked out the sun by 3 in the afternoon. Arthur was an accountant for the mill, a man of rigid routines, starched collars, and quiet, predictable affection. But when I was 7 months pregnant with our second child, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over him. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow rot. He stopped coming home for dinner. He stopped asking about my day. He would sit in his armchair in the dark, staring at the dead fireplace, his eyes glassy and distant, completely unresponsive to the world around him. Then he stopped coming home entirely. His company told me over a brief, clipped phone call that he had requested an emergency transfer to their remote sorting facility deep in the Cascade Mountains. They offered no explanation, and Arthur offered no goodbye. For 3 agonizing months, I heard absolutely nothing. His cell phone rang dead. The only proof he was still alive and existing in this world was the automated monthly deposit in our joint checking account. I was left alone in the freezing woods with a swelling belly and our 10-year-old son, Tommy, who cried himself to sleep asking why his father had abandoned us. My breaking point came in mid-December. The mailman, his truck struggling against the accumulating snowdrifts, delivered a thick, manila envelope from the mill's corporate office. It was Arthur's termination letter. He hadn't been to work in 90 days. The deposits were going to stop. I didn't care about the severe snowstorm warning broadcast over the radio. I didn't care about the freezing, treacherous mountain roads or the fact that my fingers were completely numb against the steering wheel. I packed Tommy into the passenger seat of my rusted Subaru, threw 2 heavy wool blankets in the back, and we drove straight into the jagged, white spine of the Cascades to find my husband and demand an answer. The address Arthur's company had on file didn't lead to a corporate housing complex or a cabin. It led us down a winding, unpaved logging road to a dilapidated, 2-story boarding house sitting alone on a desolate ridge. The structure looked like a rotting tooth against the gray sky, surrounded by dead, skeletal pines. The air up there was thin, biting, and tasted distinctly of copper and old wet ash. I left Tommy in the running car with the heater on and trudged through knee-deep snow up to the wraparound porch. The wood groaned under my boots. I hammered my fist against the peeling paint of the front door. When the landlord answered, I immediately felt a cold stone drop in my stomach. He was an older, gaunt man with deep, bruised bags under his eyes and a nervous, violent twitch in his jaw. He kept the chain lock engaged, peering out at me through a narrow crack, the smell of cheap whiskey and bleach wafting out from the darkness behind him. "He ain't here," the landlord stammered, his voice a gravelly whisper the moment I mentioned Arthur's name. His pale eyes darted frantically toward the tree line behind me, as if expecting something to emerge from the freezing fog. "Arthur left a month ago, packed his bags in the dead of night and walked off into the woods. I don't know where he is, lady, and I swear to God I don't want to know. You need to leave, right now. I am not leaving until you tell me what happened to my husband," I shouted, the freezing wind whipping my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks. "He hasn't been to work in 3 months. He has a family." The landlord swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. He looked over my shoulder again, his paranoia palpable, before his trembling hands reached up and unlatched the chain. He motioned for me to step inside quickly, slamming the heavy door shut behind me and throwing 3 separate deadbolts. The hallway was dimly lit by a single, flickering amber bulb. It smelled of rotting wood, damp earth, and something sickeningly sweet, like overripe fruit turning to mush. He led me down the narrow corridor to the very last door on the left. I noticed immediately that the door had been heavily boarded up. Thick wooden planks were nailed horizontally across the frame, and a heavy iron padlock secured a thick chain around the handle. It was locked from the outside. When Arthur left, he took everything, the landlord whispered, his voice shaking so badly he had to lean against the peeling wallpaper for support. Everything except that. He pointed a long, bony finger toward a small, rickety wooden table sitting just outside Arthur's boarded-up room. Sitting on it was a box. It was about the size of a shoebox, but it looked incredibly dense. It was made of heavy, dark, unvarnished oak. I stepped closer, my brow furrowing in confusion. It was completely smooth. There were no hinges, no lid, no lock, no keyhole, no seams whatsoever. It was a perfectly solid, seamless block of wood, yet it felt hollow. "Take it," the landlord pleaded, stepping backward, putting distance between himself and the table. "Just take his damn box and get off my property. Please." "Why did he leave? Did he say why he was fired?" I demanded, turning back to him, refusing to touch the bizarre object. "Look," the landlord hissed, his patience snapping, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. "He brought a woman here, a girl, young, with jet black hair that fell to her waist and skin so pale it looked translucent. He told me she was his new wife. He said he finally found perfection. But something was horribly wrong with her, lady. When she looked at you, it felt like your lungs were filling with crushed ice. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe right. We heard them fighting one night, a terrible, violent screaming that shook the floorboards. It sounded like animals tearing each other apart. The next morning, the door was wide open, the room was empty, and that box was sitting dead in the center of the rug. I nailed the door shut and I haven't slept a full night since. "Just take it and go." My stomach plummeted. The betrayal hit me harder than the freezing mountain air. Another woman. That was why he vanished. That was why he abandoned his son and his unborn child. He had lost his mind and run off with some girl. I grabbed the heavy oak box, intending to throw it at the wall, but its unnatural weight shocked me. It felt as if it were filled with wet sand and lead, and it was freezing, colder than the snow outside. I carried it out to the car, my vision blurring with angry, hot tears. I threw it onto the floorboards in the back seat next to Tommy, slammed the door, and drove away from the rotting house. By the time we made it back down the steepest part of the mountain, the snowstorm had escalated into a total whiteout. The heavy sheets of snow buried the asphalt, making it impossible to see 10 feet past the hood of the car. We were forced to pull over and check into a cheap, isolated roadside motel off the highway. We were completely trapped for the night. The motel room was dingy, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. I set the heavy wooden box on the scratched laminate dresser near the television and sat heavily on the edge of the sagging mattress, burying my face in my trembling hands. The exhaustion, the crushing betrayal, and the sheer terror of our financial reality were suffocating me. "Mom!" Tommy's voice was small, hesitant, cutting through the hum of the struggling wall heater. I looked up. Tommy had unzipped his winter coat and was standing near the dresser, his pale face illuminated by the flickering neon sign outside the window. He was staring down at the seamless wooden box. "Mom!" he repeated, his voice wavering, his finger pointing nervously. Why is it bleeding? I stood up, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I crossed the faded carpet and looked down at the dresser. A thick, viscous, dark crimson fluid was pooling at the base of the solid wooden box. It wasn't dripping from a crack or a seam. There were none. The liquid was seeping directly out of the smooth, unblemished grain of the oak itself, like sweat pushing through pores. I grabbed a scratchy motel washcloth from the bathroom and wiped at the liquid. The cheap white fabric stained a bright, horrifying red instantly. It wasn't tree sap. It wasn't oil. It was warm to the touch. It smelled metallic. "Don't touch it, Tommy. Get back on the bed," I ordered, my voice tight with panic. I grabbed the box with both of my bare hands, determined to carry it outside and throw it into the snowbank. But the absolute second my flesh made contact with the wet wood, a searing, white-hot pain shot through my palms. It felt like grabbing an exposed electrical wire. I screamed and dropped it. The box hit the carpet with a sickening, heavy thud that rattled the floor. I looked down at my hands, gasping for air. Across the center of my right palm, a deep, jagged laceration had split wide open, bleeding freely down my wrist. But the box had no sharp edges. It was a perfectly smooth block. Before I could grab a towel to wrap my bleeding hand, the lights in the motel room flickered violently, buzzed like a dying hornet, and snapped off. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Tommy screamed, a piercing sound of pure terror, and scrambled backward against the headboard of the bed. I fumbled blindly in the dark, my bleeding hand smearing against the wall as I searched for the light switch, but the power grid to the entire motel seemed to be dead. But the room wasn't entirely pitch black. Down on the carpet, near the foot of the bed, the wooden box was glowing. It wasn't casting light like a lamp. It was a faint, sickly, deep-sea luminescence. A pale, necrotic green radiating from beneath the wood grain, illuminating the dark crimson blood that now completely coated its surface. And then the voice began. It wasn't coming from the walls. It wasn't coming from outside the thin motel window. It was coming from inside the seamless block of wood. It was a woman's voice, soft, melodic, impossibly, sickeningly sweet. "Arthur, it's so dark in here. Let me out, Arthur. I'm so cold." The voice echoed in my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. Felt like wet fingers tracing the inside of my brain. Tommy covered his ears, sobbing hysterically. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the searing pain in my hand, and grabbed the heavy, brass base of the motel desk lamp. I gripped it like a club, positioning myself between my terrified son and the glowing square of wood on the floor. "Arthur." The voice purred again, the melodic sweetness suddenly melting away into a raspy, guttural snarl that sounded like grinding stones. The sudden shift in tone was so violent it rattled the thin glass of the windows in their frames. "If you don't let me out, I'll take the boy. I'll take the boy and I'll pull him down into the dark with me." A massive, deafening sound, like a thunderclap inside the tiny room, exploded through the air, followed by the sharp, terrifying sound of a snapping violin string. Instantly, the glowing stopped. The motel lights flickered back on, blindingly bright. The heater roared back to life. The box sat on the cheap carpet, completely inert. The blood that had coated it mere seconds ago was entirely gone. It was just a dry, smooth block of dark oak. I didn't sleep a single second that night. I sat rigid in the plastic chair by the window, the heavy brass lamp gripped tightly in my bleeding, bandaged hand, staring unblinking at the box while Tommy cried himself into an exhausted sleep. Every time the wind howled against the siding, I expected the wood to start glowing again. I expected that impossible, dead voice to slither out. The next morning, the snow plows finally cleared the main mountain pass. I didn't bother packing our bags properly. I threw the box into the trunk of the Subaru, slammed it shut with all my strength, and drove straight down the mountain to the lumber mill's corporate office in the valley. If Arthur had a mistress, if this was some sick, elaborate psychological game he was playing to scare me into signing divorce papers, I was going to rip the truth out of his coworkers. I marched into the brightly lit administrative office, my clothes disheveled, my hand wrapped in a bloody motel towel, demanding to speak to anyone who worked closely with Arthur. The receptionists looked terrified, threatening to call the police, until a pale, nervous man in a wrinkled suit finally pulled me aside. He ushered me into an empty, windowless break room and locked the door behind us. His name was Paul. He was Arthur's senior accountant. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His skin was gray, and his hands shook so violently he could barely hold his styrofoam cup of coffee. "You shouldn't have come looking for him, Sarah," Paul whispered, his voice cracking, constantly looking over his shoulder at the frosted glass door of the break room. "Arthur isn't coming back. Nobody is coming back. Did he leave with her? The woman with the black hair? The one the landlord saw?" I demanded, slamming my uninjured hand against the table. "Tell me where they went." Paul's eyes widened in sheer panic. He lunged forward, grabbing my wrist. "You don't understand what she is. She isn't a woman, Sarah. She isn't human." Paul leaned in, his voice dropping to a frantic, breathless whisper. "About 6 months ago, Arthur was incredibly depressed. He felt isolated. He found a book at an estate sale a few towns over. An old, hand-bound, leather journal written by a 19th century occultist who traveled out west. It detailed a ritual, an ancient, forbidden manifestation process. It claimed that if a man's desire, his loneliness, and his sheer force of will were potent enough, he could pull a physical entity out of the ether to serve him. A perfect, obedient companion born entirely from his own mind. A thought form made flesh. He called it an Evelyn. I stared at him, my mouth dry, repulsion washing over me. "You're telling me my husband tried to perform dark magic to cheat on his pregnant wife?" "I'm telling you he succeeded," Paul said, his voice shaking violently, tears pooling in his bloodshot eyes. "He brought her to the office holiday party back in October. She was breathtaking, flawless, but there was no warmth to her, no humanity behind her eyes. She never blinked, Sarah. She didn't breathe." When the regional manager, Mr. Henderson, told Arthur it was highly inappropriate to bring a girl that young to a corporate event, she just turned and smiled at him. A smile with too many teeth. Paul swallowed hard, rubbing his trembling hands over his face. The next morning, Mr. Henderson was found dead in his driveway. His spine was snapped in 3 completely separate places, folded backward. He was crushed. The medical examiners said it looked like he was put into an industrial hydraulic press. But there were no tire tracks, no heavy machinery, just him, folded in half on the concrete. Paul grabbed my arm again, his grip painfully tight, his fingernails digging into my skin. Arthur realized what he had done. He realized that Evelyn wasn't a companion. She was a violently possessive predator tethered directly to his soul. She viewed anyone who interfered with him, anyone who stressed him out, as a threat to be eradicated. And she was getting stronger. He told me he found a reversal incantation in the back pages of the journal. A way to sever the tie and bind her chaotic energy into a physical containment vessel. A seamless wooden box carved from a lightning-struck oak. My blood ran absolutely cold, turning to ice in my veins. The heavy oak box, the bleeding, glowing block of wood sitting in the trunk of my car right now. He tried to trap her? I asked, my breath catching in my throat, the horrific realization dawning on me. He tried. Paul wept, a tear slipping down his cheek, his facade completely breaking. He went up to that isolated boarding house to perform the banishing ritual away from everyone. But he underestimated her rage. He underestimated how real she had become. He didn't trap her in the box, Sarah. Paul looked me dead in the eyes, his face pale with absolute, unadulterated terror. The ritual backfired. She dragged him in there with her. The break room walls seemed to close in on me, the hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly deafening in the wake of Paul's words. My husband wasn't missing in the woods. He wasn't hiding out in a cabin with a younger woman. He was trapped inside a seamless block of oak sitting in the trunk of my freezing car, dragged down into a claustrophobic, lightless purgatory by a parasite he had conjured from his own miserable isolation. I stumbled out of the administrative office, ignoring the panicked questions of the receptionists, my boots slipping on the salted concrete of the parking lot. The cold air hit my lungs like shattered glass. I reached the Subaru, staring at the trunk. The metal lid was covered in a thin layer of frost, but directly in the center, right above where the box rested inside, the frost had melted away. The metal was radiating a sickly, unnatural heat. I got into the driver's seat. Tommy was huddled in the back, clutching his video game console, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. He didn't ask where his father was. I think, in the terrifying, intuitive way that children process horror, he already knew that whatever was happening was beyond a simple explanation. I put the car in drive and pulled out onto the icy highway, heading back toward the dilapidated motel. The drive was a suffocating nightmare. The heater was blasting on high, yet the temperature inside the cabin plummeted. My breath plumed into thick, white clouds. Then the physical manifestations began. The suspension of the Subaru groaned violently, the rear tires scraping against the wheel wells. It felt as if a tremendous, crushing weight had suddenly been dropped into the trunk, pressing the back of the car down toward the asphalt. The steering wheel jerked in my hands. The radio, which had been turned completely off, suddenly hissed to life. It wasn't broadcasting static or a local station. It was playing the sound of a man weeping. It was a wet, muffled, agonizing sound, buried under layers of crushing pressure. "Arthur?" I whispered, my knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. The weeping abruptly stopped, severed by a sharp crack of static. Then, the sweet, melodic, dead voice I had heard in the motel room poured out of the 4 car speakers simultaneously, vibrating the doors. "He can't hear you, Sarah. His mouth is full of dirt. His eyes are full of splinters. He belongs to the dark now." I slammed my fist into the radio dial, violently twisting it, but the power button wouldn't depress. I reached under the dashboard while keeping one eye on the treacherous road and physically ripped the wiring harness out of the back of the stereo. Sparks showered over my boots, and the cabin plunged back into a terrifying silence, save for the hum of the tires. We made it back to the motel just as the afternoon sky bruised into a deep, dark purple. The snow was falling heavily again, isolating us from the rest of the world. I popped the trunk. I couldn't leave the box in the car. It felt like leaving a bomb unattended. I needed to see it. I needed to figure out how to break it open. I wrapped my bleeding right hand in a thick wool scarf, using my left hand and my forearms to hoist the heavy oak block out of the trunk. It was heavier than before, incredibly dense, practically vibrating with a low, kinetic energy. I carried it inside, kicking the motel door shut and dropping the box onto the center of the cheap laminate table. "Stay on the bed, Tommy," I commanded, my voice trembling but firm. "Do not get near this table. Do you understand me?" He nodded, pulling his knees to his chest, wrapping himself in the heavy quilt. I stood over the box, examining every square inch of it under the harsh glare of the overhead light. Paul had said Arthur used a banishing incantation to trap the entity, but the spell backfired. This wood was meant to be a prison. If I could break the physical vessel, maybe the binding would shatter. Maybe I could pull Arthur out. I searched the motel room and found a heavy, iron fire poker resting next to the small, decorative gas fireplace. I gripped it tightly, raising it high above my head, aiming dead center for the top of the oak block. I brought it down with every ounce of strength I had, putting the full weight of my pregnant body behind the swing. The iron struck the wood with a deafening, metallic clang. The poker didn't dent the wood. It didn't even scratch the finish. The impact sent a violent, bone-rattling shockwave up my arms, completely numbing my shoulders. The iron rod bent backward, warped by the sheer, unnatural density of the box. Suddenly, the rotary phone on the nightstand screamed. It was a shrill, piercing ring that made both Tommy and me jump. I dropped the bent poker, my chest heaving, and slowly walked over to the bed. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver. "Hello," I panted. "Sarah." A voice wheezed through the receiver. It was Paul. He sounded completely, utterly destroyed, his breathing ragged and wet. "Sarah, you have to leave. You have to get away from the box. She knows I told you. She's here." "Paul, where are you?" "Call the police," I yelled into the phone. "You can't arrest a shadow, Sarah," Paul sobbed, his voice laced with excruciating agony. "She's in my house. The lights are all blown. She's standing at the end of the hallway, but her feet aren't touching the floor. Oh God, her eyes are just black holes. She's pointing at me. My legs. I can't feel my legs." I heard a sickening sound over the line, like wet celery snapping in half, followed by a blood-curdling scream that tore Paul's throat apart. The sound of heavy, unnatural crunching echoed through the earpiece as Paul's screams dissolved into a gurgling choke. "Paul! Paul!" I screamed. The line went dead with a heavy click. The entity had paralyzed him. She had crushed him from miles away just for speaking her name, exactly as she had done to the regional manager. She was protecting her prize. She was protecting the box. I slammed the phone down, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. I looked over at the table. The wood was bleeding again. Thick, dark crimson rivers were pouring out of the grain, spilling over the edges of the laminate table and dripping onto the carpet with a heavy, rhythmic splashing sound. "Mom!" Tommy whimpered. I spun around. Tommy was sitting upright on the bed, his hands clawing desperately at his own throat. His face was turning a deep, terrifying shade of violet. His feet kicked violently against the mattress. "Tommy!" I screamed, lunging across the room. I grabbed his small hands, trying to pull them away from his neck, but his fingers were rigid. He wasn't choking himself. There was an invisible, crushing pressure clamped tightly around his windpipe. I could physically see the skin of his throat compressing, pale, phantom finger indentations digging into his flesh. "Let him go!" I shrieked, batting at the empty air above him. The air in the room was freezing, but right above my son, there was a pocket of freezing, stagnant dread, smelling of rotting wood and ozone. I turned back to the table. The box was pulsing. It was expanding and contracting rhythmically, like a lung taking in air. I grabbed the heavy, bent fire poker from the floor and sprinted at the table. I didn't aim for the top this time. I swung the iron rod like a baseball bat, aiming for the side of the box, intending to knock it completely off the table and out the glass window. The heavy iron connected. The box flew backward, smashing through the motel window in an explosion of shattered glass and splintered wood. It vanished into the howling blizzard outside, swallowed by the darkness and the snow. Instantly, the invisible grip on Tommy's throat vanished. He collapsed onto the pillows, coughing violently, gasping for huge lungfuls of air. I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around his shaking body, crying into his hair. Deep, dark purple bruises were already forming in the shape of two large hands around his neck. The freezing wind howled through the shattered window, coating the cheap carpet in snow. I stood up, grabbing the heavy wool blankets, and began nailing them over the broken frame using a heavy ashtray to pound the upholstery tacks into the drywall. We had to survive the night. We just had to survive until morning, and then I would put Tommy on a bus to my sister's house in California. I would deal with Arthur and the box alone. I pushed the heavy dresser in front of the door, locked the deadbolt, and huddled on the bed with my son. The hours bled together in a terrifying, adrenaline-fueled blur. The wind screamed outside, battering the motel. Every shadow looked like a figure standing in the corner. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps. Around 3 a.m., the temperature in the room plummeted so fast my teeth began to chatter violently. The water in the half-empty plastic cups on the nightstand froze solid, cracking the plastic. The heavy dresser I had pushed against the door began to slide. It wasn't being pushed from the outside. It was sliding backward, scraping painfully against the carpet, moving under its own power. Then the deadbolt slowly turned. The brass handle clicked. The door drifted open, revealing the swirling, freezing blackness of the blizzard outside. Standing in the doorway was Evelyn. She was exactly as Paul and the landlord had described, but their words couldn't possibly capture the sheer, mind-breaking terror of her physical presence. She appeared to be a young woman in her early 20s, wearing a simple, pale vintage dress. Her hair was jet black, falling in wet, heavy sheets down to her waist. But her skin was completely wrong. Possessed no texture, no pores, no flush of blood. It looked like hardened, polished porcelain, unnaturally white and slightly translucent in the dim light. And she wasn't touching the ground. She hovered exactly 2 inches above the snow-covered threshold, her bare, pale feet perfectly still. She slowly raised her head. Her eyes had no irises, no pupils, no whites. They were completely solid, bottomless voids of pure, glossy black ink that seemed to swallow the light around them. When she looked at me, an agonizing spike of pressure drove directly into the center of my forehead, making me dizzy with nausea. She didn't open her mouth to speak, but her voice echoed inside the cramped room, bouncing off the walls, slipping into my ears like freezing water. "You are so stubborn, Sarah, like a dog digging at a grave. Arthur is mine. He built me. He fed me with his isolation. He shaped me with his misery. He is the architect and I am the masterpiece. And you are just Clutter. She tilted her head, a slow, sickeningly wide smile stretching across her face. The skin around her mouth tore slightly, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too perfectly aligned. I tried to be gentle, the voice purred in my mind. I tried to scare you away. I broke his co-workers. I gave you the box so you would see the blood and run. But you brought it back inside. You tried to break it. She slowly raised a pale, unnaturally long finger, pointing it directly at my swollen stomach. You have something of his inside you. Parasite. Another piece of clutter taking his attention away from me. I think I will take that first. Then I will take the boy. She began to glide forward, passing the threshold, the freezing wind whipping around her, violently extinguishing the single working lamp in the room. We were plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint, eerie moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. I didn't scream. My terror had transcended panic and solidified into pure, maternal rage. I grabbed a small bottle of rubbing alcohol from the bathroom counter that I had used to clean my wounded hand earlier. I unscrewed the cap, doused the heavy motel quilt in the flammable liquid, and grabbed a book of matches from the nightstand. He's my husband. I snarled, my voice steady, venomous, and entirely devoid of fear, and you are nothing but a mistake he made in the dark. I struck the match against the abrasive strip and tossed it onto the soaked quilt. The heavy fabric erupted in a blinding, roaring wall of orange and yellow fire, instantly illuminating the room and driving back the freezing cold. The sudden burst of light and extreme heat caught the entity off guard. The tulpa was born from cold isolation and dark, damp wood. She recoiled, throwing her pale hands up to shield her solid black eyes. A sound ripped from her throat. Not a voice in my head, but a physical, ear-shattering shriek of genuine, agonizing pain that sounded like thousands of dry twigs snapping at once. The flawless porcelain illusion of her skin began to blister and crack under the intense heat of the fire, revealing dark, rotting wood pulsing beneath the surface. "Run, Tommy! Out the door!" I screamed, grabbing his arm and shoving him toward the exit. We sprinted past the burning bed, past the shrieking, glitching monstrosity of the tulpa, and out into the freezing blizzard. I didn't look back. I ran toward the Subaru, my boots sliding in the snow, the keys already clutched in my bleeding hand. I threw Tommy into the passenger seat, jumped behind the wheel, and slammed the car into drive. The tires spun furiously on the ice before finally catching traction. As I sped out of the motel parking lot, leaving the burning room behind, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing in the center of the snowy road, illuminated by the red glow of my taillights, was the seamless oak box. I hadn't thrown it into the woods at all. It had never left the room. It had just made me see what it wanted me to see. And as I drove away into the whiteout, a new sound began to echo from the trunk of my car. It was the slow, desperate, agonizing sound of fingernails frantically scratching against the inside of a heavy wooden lid. The scratching from the trunk didn't stop. It evolved. It grew louder, more frantic. The sound of tearing cuticles and snapping fingernails scraping against an immovable, unyielding surface. It vibrated through the chassis of the Subaru, traveling up the steering column and directly into my numb, bleeding hands. I kept the accelerator pinned, the bald tires of the rusted car fishtailing wildly over the black ice that coated the winding mountain pass. The blizzard outside had transformed the world into a claustrophobic, swirling tunnel of white, illuminated only by the weak, yellow beams of my headlights. Beside me, Tommy sat curled into a tight, trembling ball, his hands clamped firmly over his ears, his eyes squeezed shut. "Don't listen to it, Tommy," I commanded, my voice hoarse, my chest heaving with adrenaline. "Keep your eyes closed. We're almost to the main highway." It was a lie. We were miles from anything resembling civilization, trapped in the unforgiving throat of the Cascades. Then, the scratching stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. It was a voice, muffled, distorted, and drowning in a thick, wet static, broadcasting directly through the car's broken radio speakers, despite the wires hanging loose under the dashboard. "Sarah." It was Arthur. It wasn't the demonic, melodic purr of the tulpa mimicking him. It was my husband. His voice was ragged, weak, and laced with an agony so profound it made my stomach violently heave. "Sarah, please. It's so heavy in here. I can't breathe. The walls are closing. She's eating my memories, Sarah. She's taking my mind." Tears streamed down my freezing cheeks, blurring my vision. "Arthur, I'm here. I have the box. I'm going to get you out." I screamed at the dashboard, my heart tearing in half. The man had betrayed me. He had abandoned his family. But hearing the raw, suffocating torture in his voice stripped away my anger, leaving only a desperate, primitive horror. "You can't." Arthur's voice sobbed, accompanied by the sickening sound of wet wood shifting and compressing. "There is no door, Sarah. There is no lock. I built her to be perfect. I built her to never leave me. The box isn't a prison for her. It's an incubator. She dragged me inside to feed. If you open it, you let her out completely." The supernatural weight I had felt earlier suddenly crashed down upon the rear of the car with the force of a falling boulder. The Subaru's rear axle shrieked, snapping with a violently loud metallic crack. The back tires blew out simultaneously. The steering wheel jerked violently out of my grip. The car went into an uncontrollable spin, the headlights painting dizzying arcs across the pine trees before we slammed sideways into a massive, compacted snowbank. The impact deployed my airbag, punching the breath from my lungs and sending a shockwave of pain through my pregnant belly. Silence descended instantly, broken only by the hiss of the dying radiator and the relentless howling of the mountain wind. I gasped for air, fighting through the thick smoke of the airbag. I turned frantically to the passenger seat. Tommy was bruised, a thin line of blood trickling from his nose where he had bumped the dashboard. But he was conscious, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I'm okay, Mom," he whispered, his entire body shaking. Before I could unbuckle my seatbelt, the trunk of the car slowly, deliberately popped open. The hydraulic hinges groaned in the freezing air. The temperature inside the cabin instantly plummeted past freezing. Frost bloomed across the inside of the windshield, creeping over the glass like intricate, skeletal fingers, plunging us into near-total darkness. "Tommy, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice dropping to a dead, serious whisper. I unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed him down into the footwell of the passenger seat, throwing the heavy wool blanket over him. "Do not move. Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear me say, no matter what you hear your father say, you stay under this blanket. Do you understand me?" He nodded underneath the heavy wool. I kicked my door open and stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The cold was absolute, a physical force that immediately stole the breath from my lungs. The wind whipped my hair into my eyes as I slowly, agonizingly made my way toward the rear of the wrecked vehicle. The trunk was wide open. Sitting dead in the center, illuminated by the red glow of the shattered taillights, was the seamless oak box. It was no longer inert. It was violently shuddering, vibrating so intensely it was slowly rotating on the carpeted floorboard of the trunk. Thick, black, viscous fluid, smelling of rotting leaves, stagnant water, and ancient earth, was violently bubbling up through the microscopic grain of the wood. Then, she stepped out from the tree line. Evelyn didn't hover this time. She dragged herself through the deep snow, her movements erratic, broken, and deeply wrong, like a marionette with severed strings. The fire in the motel room had devastated her physical manifestation. The pale, flawless porcelain skin on the left side of her face had entirely melted away, revealing the horrifying truth beneath. A skull made of jagged, charred, splintered wood, pulsing with that sickly green luminescence. Her vintage dress was singed and clinging to a body that looked more like a twisted, burned root system than a human form. Her single remaining eye, a bottomless pit of glossy black ink, locked onto me. "You burned me," her voice echoed, not in the air, but scraping directly against the inside of my skull. The sickening sweetness was gone. It was a chaotic, overlapping chorus of grinding stones and snapping branches. "You damaged the vessel. You hurt Arthur." She raised a charred, wooden claw toward the trunk. The heavy oak box levitated inches into the air, the black fluid dripping from its invisible pores, sizzling as it hit the snow. "He wanted a family that wouldn't demand anything from him?" Evelyn sneered, her melted jaw unhinging unnaturally wide. "He wanted quiet. He wanted submission. I gave him exactly what he begged for. And now you are trying to take my creator away. I will pull you both into the dark. I will let you listen to your children suffocate in the wood." She lunged forward, her burned body covering the distance between the trees and the car with terrifying speed. My maternal instinct completely overrode my terror. I didn't reach for a weapon to strike her. I reached into the trunk and grabbed the heavy, iron resting next to the spare tire compartment. I didn't swing at the monstrosity rushing toward me. I spun around and brought the heavy iron bar down directly onto the center of the levitating oak box. The impact was deafening. A shock wave of pure, kinetic energy exploded outward, throwing me backward into the snow. The box hit the floor of the trunk with a sickening thud. Evelyn shrieked, a sound of pure, agonizing vibration. She collapsed into the snow 10 feet away, clutching her chest, her wooden limbs convulsing violently. The box was her heart. It was the anchor tethering her thought form to the physical world. I scrambled to my feet, my torn palm screaming in agony, the blood freezing instantly to the iron bar. I raised it again. "Sarah, stop!" Arthur's voice screamed from inside the box, the sound tearing through the crisp mountain air. "If you break it, I die. I'm bound to it, Sarah. I'm in the wood. Don't kill me." I froze, the tire iron suspended above my head. The heavy, suffocating weight of his plea paralyzed me. He was in there. The man I had loved, the father of my children, was trapped in that lightless purgatory, begging for his life. Evelyn began to drag herself toward me again, her charred jaw snapping, her remaining black eye fixated on the unborn child in my stomach. "Sarah, please," Arthur wept from the box. "I can fix this. Just let her take the boy. She just wants the boy. Then she'll let me go. We can start over." A cold, horrifying clarity washed over me, sharper than the freezing wind. That wasn't Arthur. Arthur was weak, he was cowardly, and he had made a catastrophic mistake out of selfishness. But he would never offer his son to a monster. The entity was wearing his voice. It was wearing his memories. The Real Arthur had been consumed the moment he was dragged into the dark. There was nothing left to save. There was only the parasite. "You are nothing," I whispered, staring down at the bleeding block of oak. I brought the iron bar down with every microscopic ounce of strength left in my exhausted, freezing body. Crack. The iron struck the exact center of the block. For a fraction of a second, the wood held. Then, a single microscopic hairline fracture appeared down the center. A blinding, explosive burst of necrotic green light erupted from the fracture. A sound unlike anything I have ever heard. A chorus of 1,000 screaming voices, a hurricane of trapped, suffocating wind, and the deafening snap of a massive redwood tree breaking in half, blasted out of the trunk. The seamless oak box violently detonated. Shards of black, rotting wood and thick, foul-smelling tar exploded outward, showering the snow. I threw my arms up to protect my face, the heavy iron bar falling from my numb fingers. A final, agonizing shriek tore through the clearing. I turned to look at Evelyn. The tulpa was dissolving. The unnatural, thought-form matter that composed her body rapidly lost its cohesion. The charred wood, the porcelain skin, the black ink of her eyes. It all crumbled into a fine, gray ash that was instantly caught by the howling blizzard and scattered into nothingness among the dead pines. The oppressive, crushing supernatural weight lifted from the air instantly. The biting cold of the mountain remained, but the unnatural, freezing dread was completely gone. I collapsed against the bumper of the ruined Subaru, my knees giving out, my chest heaving as I gasped for clean air. The snow was quickly burying the shattered, mundane fragments of wood scattered across the trunk. There was no blood. There was no green light. It was just dead timber. I crawled to the passenger door and wrenched it open. Tommy threw the blanket off and practically tackled me, burying his face in my neck, sobbing uncontrollably. I held him tighter than I ever had, burying my face in his hair, crying until there were no tears left to shed. We stayed huddled in the footwell of the car, wrapped in every blanket we had, sharing our body heat as the snowstorm raged through the night. Just after dawn, the storm broke. The sky faded into a pale, bruised blue. An hour later, the deep, rumbling growl of a county snowplow echoed down the mountain pass. The flashing amber lights cut through the tree line, illuminating our wrecked, frozen car. They took us to a hospital in the valley. We were treated for minor frostbite and shock. The police questioned me about the crash, and I told them a buck had run out into the road during the whiteout. They towed the car, and they never found anything unusual in the trunk except a few pieces of shattered, rotting oak. Arthur was officially declared a missing person. The police searched the boarding house, but they found no trace of him, no trace of the black-haired woman, and no physical evidence of a struggle. It was as if he had simply walked off the face of the earth. We moved back east a month later, back to my hometown in Pennsylvania, far away from the suffocating shadows of the Pacific Northwest timberline. I had a beautiful, healthy baby girl. We built a quiet, normal life, but I never bought another piece of heavy wooden furniture. I never walked through a dense forest again. And sometimes, on the coldest nights of the winter, when the frost creeps up the windows and the house settles into a deep, dead silence, I swear I can hear the faintest sound of fingernails scratching against the inside of the walls.